So in this image, I'm just going to show you some tricks towards the end that are going to help make things work better. One thing though that I want to share with you right now up front, this is what the photograph was. And then I put a levels to it. And all of a sudden we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 folds in the front, where there's some shadow that wasn't as visible before. So that you're not inventing anything along the way, especially if you're copying photo reference and all of that. And if you're embellishing from the photo, then anything goes, but what you don't see, you won't put in from your reference. And it might end up looking flat in some areas, and it might end up looking full in some areas, which will look a little bit awkward, like some areas were informed and some areas we still don't really know much about yet. So we begin with the armature again. This is a very quick, rough armature, and a quick skeleton, and any muscles that might affect change on the surface of the material that we're copying. And then the cut lines of the clothing. Making sure that the ellipses are drawn and making sure that all the folds are appropriately and properly placed in their crease position. And of course that is there to make sure that the perspective is working correctly in the picture. And then putting in the construction. And in this case the construction is fairly simple. There wasn't a lot to put in. And then blocking in the local values to start everything off. In this case, we definitely need the skin tones to help us. We have projection that's involved with the skin tones. We have the little shadow patterns from the lace being cast upon them. Therefore, we kind of need them in there. But also, because the lace is lighter than the skin, we need the skin in there to help regulate the value of the lace. I then put in a veil where the light is going to be painted in over the top of the torso. And then there's this cut line layer that I also put in, which just gives a rough indication of where exactly I'm going to be pushing the polygons, pushing the pixels, where I'm going to be erasing, where I'm going to be adding into those basic shapes of those arabesques. These larger areas are all the basic shape areas that I'm going to be painting into, and then I'll be sizing down into the smaller pieces within those spaces, and those will be much easier to identify with once I'm cutting the larger spaces out. These guidelines that I've created are there to help find all of that information, and then eventually this layer will go away. This step, in the way that I've described already, then it makes it easy for us to draw in reverse, and I actually find that I get better shapes if I'm drawing with the eraser as opposed to drawing with the brush tool. I don't know what that is all about, but I think what I think it is trying to be too careful about painting, where with the eraser, I don't think we act as careful when we pull marks out of it. It's the same act we all have when we're taking something off of a page. We have less care for it because we're removing it than if we were to put something on. So I think that sort of reverses the psychology a little bit and makes it easier to get to some of these more complex shapes. Now also keep in mind that I'm using the eraser with pressure sensitivity, so I'm bearing down where I need to pull a lot of tone away, and then I'm also being very cautious and lightening up my pressure as I get into some of the areas like the little pinch points where things are merging together where I need to be more accurate. So I'm then controlling about how heavy I'm going with the pen tool as I'm cutting and carving when I'm blocking all of this out in the picture space. If something isn't being painted to your liking, if something didn't quite make it where it needs to go, then we can use the push tool to nudge it into the position that we need it to. And we're going to zoom in here to do that because it's a little bit easier when you're closer to the object. But still, the painting should be done from a distance. And using this nudge tool, we can kind of push along here and get the little tiny doily like extra curvy shapes along there. And we don't have to be so careful about this part of it. People don't look at a painting that closely, but the pattern should still have some sort of balance to it or some sort of repeatability to it, where some of those little stubs or nubbin shapes shouldn't be so drastically different than others that all of a sudden they draw attention to themselves. And you can fine tune all of the edges in there using this tool. It's really convenient, more convenient than I think we often use it for what it is. This is just one way of working, but I've found that this is a really easy way of working and a no threat way of working, where you don't feel so tied to every brush stroke. Again, because it's the eraser, it's taking things away rather than putting them in. And for whatever reason, when it is in that order, it makes it a little bit easier to do what we need to do, get through it quicker, and not be so tied down to it. And like with any painting, we really don't want to be too close up to the surface when we're working on it. And like any painting, we don't really want to be too close to the surface when we're working on it. Being too close to the surface when we're working on it just makes it harder for us to relate what we're doing in that immediate moment with everything else that's surrounding it, and sometimes things can be thrown out of balance very quickly. As I've been mentioning, you want to be zoomed out because it's easier for you to build a picture when you're going from the biggest items to the smallest items, from the largest to the smallest. So you scale out and you work on the largest shapes, and that's within the biggest picture space. You have better organization between those shapes because you can see all of them. And then when you zoom in onto those shapes, you work on them a little bit, zoom back out to make sure they still fit, and then you can zoom in and you can stay in there for quite a while as long as you don't arrange a new value structure. It's that value structure that you're holding on to once you're at a distance from the object, and when you're trying to put that entire picture together. But that zoom in is still an important moment as well, just to fine tune and clean things up. It's just that we really don't want to put the whole picture in that space. That's just not a good, healthy space to be working in. So as an example, like these little shapes right here, I can erase on the inside of them. Knowing where the structure line is, I can erase around on the inside of them and keep the pixels around the structure line intact, and then erase on the other side of the line and build around that. And instead of having to hand paint the circles, I've now erased everything surrounding them, and then I can fine tune back into that if I need to and clean up the structure of the circle. But I didn't actually have to hand draw one, especially if I'm not very good at completing a shape like a circle, making it all the way back around and making it connect, which is a skill that needs to be learned. But if I don't have that skill right now, then I can get around that in other ways. If the picture ends up really spotted, then I can always color pick around in the other spaces right around in here and grab those values and fill the spaces with them. I've got the brush a little bit larger as well so that it overlaps bad pixels and good pixels at the same time, kind of crushing them into the same pixel range, and that joins the noise and gives it a complete feeling rather than it just feeling all broken up and scattered. So there it is. I kind of jumped ahead to show you this little trick, which maybe I should have waited till the very end. But at least with that now, you kind of understand or get a better understanding of the process for decoration or the decor on this lace. And while you're working here, you can always take away the design lines and kind of get a better understanding of the values that you've put in. You can turn that layer on and off, and you can kind of see your results, which is actually, when the line layer is on there, it doesn't look like you've done very much because a lot of the pixels that you have are underneath those lines. But in reality here, it's looking pretty nice and really delicate as well, because I'm avoiding those very small places that the line drawing suggested in the very beginning. If I do this with a little more care, I'll have a much stronger line design scribbled in there so that I know more about what's going on in that space than just the few lines that I put in. But now I'm going to backstep. I'm going to go back to those shadow patterns and lay those in. So let's do that here. So let's forget that we saw that for a moment and back step over here into the shadow patterns. So I'm cleaning up just a few more of these little shapes right here, but here's the cool reason for doing all of this in this stage right now. I'm going to take this layer and I'm going to duplicate it here. Then I'm going to take the underlayer here and I'm going to inverse it and I'm going to darken it. And then I'm going to nudge it over a little. And the keyboard command for inversing that is Control-Shift-I. And that'll inverse the colors, or in this case the values, and now it should be dark when I slide that over. So I'm moving it around here until I have the right kind of spread of the shadow at the most extreme, or in the most extreme places, but you can see that it's everywhere right now. And then I'm going to darken it, and I'm using levels here to darken it. I'm looking for a good value range that is subtle and not too black in those spaces, because that will start to look really awkward, and it'll actually outline the pattern because of the extreme contrast, which is certainly what we don't want here. By doing all of this, what it has produced is the small cast shadows all over her body, which are a little bit easier now for us to govern when they are as far as they are away here. We can just use the eraser tool and erase back to the contact points, or where the material is actually touching her flesh. And then go up here to Gaussian blur, and I'm going to take the layer and I'm going to blur it about 4 pixels, anywhere between 2 and 4 pixels. So it doesn't have the same sharp quality as the top layer does. It'll feel projected at that point, or like a cast shadow should, which is softer on its edge than the edge that's casting it. So if I zoom in here, you can kind of see the bevel that's starting to take place, or the projection that is off to the side, influenced by the direction of the light source. At 11:24 on the marker, now I'm going around and I'm using the eraser in the whitish areas, and I'm pulling all of the dark out of those spaces so that the contrast is easier to see, because as you know, with the white layer we reduced its opacity so that it has that sheer quality to it. But of course, because of that, then the previous layer, or the other layer that I did duplicate and darken, is entirely seen through this, so we have to cut that away. And I'm using the eraser though because it's a bit more organic than just selecting the layer and eliminating everything just with a keystroke. I want it to kind of feel a little bit more in contact with the flesh, so I'm using the eraser instead. And I'm making sure that I'm getting rid of any repeating values that are anywhere in there that kind of looks like a stamp on the body. 1231 on the arm. And I'm over here now pulling all of this out in this broad way because this is being hit by the light source that's in the photograph. And then the only thing left to do here on top of all of this is to add all of the sharp little details back into the material. Making a whitish edge, and I'll use pure white for now, and I can always knock that back in opacity a little bit later. But with the pure white, at least it allows me to see where I'm making the changes and where I'm cleaning up the edges prior to letting it blend right into the rest of the picture space. We only want this in a few places. We don't want to bring the sharpness back to everything, because remember, with the receding edges, the ones that are moving back into space, those need to be a little bit softer to show that they're back further in space, versus the things that are closer to us that are going to be sharper in their clarity because of their proximity to our eye. At 13:15, and we're also pushing a few edges here and there where the darkest and the lightest edges are going to be, or where the highest point of contrast is, to suggest that. And in doing that in a few places, like where the darkest dark is, it gives the whole dress a counterpoint, or a small space that makes everything feel brighter, even though we haven't painted everything in the picture the same brightness. It's those smaller spots that are going to create the illusion of a much brighter surface. Two of those areas that are in need of more clarity are the closest surfaces to the viewer's eye, and the topmost surfaces, or the surfaces that are facing upwards towards the light, regardless of whether they're being directly lit or not. The light is coming from above, so those surfaces are just by nature going to be much brighter than the rest of the surfaces that aren't facing upward. Pushing the values around this way by having the lighter values painted in at the very end on top of the areas that I've already masked out and created, but at a darker value, and carefully painting these in along the top, I'm creating the natural gradation, which is fantastic. It's the light and the transition of the light that I was looking for earlier, but had a harder time deciding where to begin or how to begin. And in this method here, it's a step process, and as I build up, it's a natural gradation that occurs anyway. Now, it would be cleaner with all of this if I had much more time, but of course I don't want to bore you with a really long demo. They shouldn't be any longer than a half hour, so this is what we're going to do for this short of a demo. So we have a generic lace pattern in, we have their cast shadows in, and now the stage that I'm at, I'm embellishing the patterns in the light areas to bring a little bit more depth, a little more clarity and sharpness to those areas, creating more dimension within the picture space. So now I'm going to go back to the light layer, and here at the light layer I'm going to put a layer lock on it, and by putting this layer lock down, I'm prevented from painting other pixels outside of the shapes that I've already created, and I can now do whatever I need within those spaces on a much smaller level, micro details and so forth. And again, there's no competition anymore. I'm not painting beyond the pixel space that I have generated, and that's fantastic. So to generate this mask off of the pixels that have already been created, I can click over here into the box and I can select just the pixels that are there, or I can select all and nudge the pixels if I wanted to do that as well. Either way, that's going to select just the pixels that have been painted within that space, giving me a nice mask to work within. And then taking that selection and turning that into a new layer, setting it to multiply, I now have an adjustment layer on top of the white pixels that I can make a stronger turn of the form using darker values to help transition those lighter spaces that I've painted back in. And in this case, I'm using a gray value because I'm using something that isn't as dark as, well, there isn't anything harsh in here within the light source. And so it doesn't make sense to go any darker than this middle value gray, but I can paint it all over. And then again, we're using the eraser tool to paint back out. I can be a little less careful, and I can still get those forms to transition very nicely. So then the nice thing about all of this is that I can do this on several different layers above and below if I need to, and I can continue embellishing the cast shadows that are underneath, or I can continue to turn the form on the very top surface. Since there are two surfaces being affected here, the underside and the top side, having these previous layers already built out and having them as layers and not all painted into one space makes all of this so much easier for me to be able to dissect in these spaces and get to the ultimate illusion that I'm looking for within this rendering. Lace isn't really all that difficult unless you make it difficult, which in this case I haven't made anything difficult because I have every layer of information as a separate layer. I haven't grouped any of these things together or just painted in one space. That's not to say that I can't. It's that if I have a job to do, if I have a client job to do, and it requires a lot of subtlety and a lot of detail, then I would like to have control over that detail so that I can nuance it, so that I can bring it in or take it away as I need it. And I don't have to be nervous or reliant upon the rest of the painting to make that happen. The rest of the painting is in its own layer space, and as a result, I'm not going to damage anything because of that. So patterns are not difficult. They're pretty easy to make. And I'm going to show you here one more time really quickly how to make them and how to control them here. So I'm going to demonstrate this little shape right here. So with like this shape right here, I've got to first identify what it is, and it's a diamond shape. So now that I have the diamond shape painted and overpainted within its massive shape, remember big to small, then I can take the brush and I can set it to clear mode, or I can use the eraser and I can remove the smaller spaces back out of it. I prefer the brush in clear mode because it's the same markings, only it's reversing the markings, whereas the eraser tool just doesn't have the same edges. Although you can pick the brush, or you can pick the brush that you're using as your brush as an eraser, I just rather prefer using the clear mode in the brush because it's more organic, it's more natural and responsive in that way. And the nuances of what makes an eraser versus a brush, I don't have to go back in and make adjustments to the settings. I'm already there with the brush. And now with this big shape built and erased away, I can go back and forth and add to or take away from, knowing that it's on its own layer, and knowing that I found this from a much larger shape. I know that the patterns have more cohesiveness. Everything is stuck together better. It's just a cleaner design altogether. Now, like I said, it's not to say that it can't be painted, but I find that if you don't think you can paint very well, then don't paint and do other things instead that substitute or make the same marks or produce the same results. It's strange how that happens, but that is a thing. And as soon as we get used to that and flip-flop it around, eventually all barriers are destroyed, and it doesn't matter how you approach the picture. Picture is just going to be a lot easier to do at that point because you no longer think about it at all. Painting is and isn't precious. It is precious at the end when we look at the finish. It isn't precious along the way as you're building it. So just be aware of that. You can be a little bit aggressive when it comes to painting during certain stages. And when you're working in digital, you can be aggressive at any stage because there's always undo. You can always bring it back around. But to understand how much flexibility you actually have without confining yourself too soon because of all these notions that painting is this sacred thing or scary thing or whatever, those don't need to be there at all. Once we remove those notions, then we're free and we can do whatever we need to do again. And one more time here with the cast shadows. So I'm going to take this layer and I'm going to duplicate the layer. I'm going to change the layer blending mode, and I'm going to darken it down so that I've basically recreated the shadow pattern instantly by using the first pattern that I generated. I'm going to offset the layer so that it projects a cast shadow, and then I'm going to give it a Gaussian blur so it doesn't have the same strength or the same sharpness as the previous layer, because again, this is a projection. It isn't the same layer at all, so it should not feel projected, and it's a shadow pattern coming from a light object, so it shouldn't be black, it should be light. Knowing that we have created this duplicate layer and that we've turned down the opacity on the layer, I'm now going to go back into the white areas and remove the dark that's underneath in the bottom layer in those whitish areas so that it brings back the crispness or the clean quality of the white again, and what remains behind are just the little nuances of shadow that we can then either erase back up as a contact shadow against another surface or leave projected at the distance that we've chosen here, because that was the maximum distance we saw any of the shadows being projected onto the surface below. And then there's this nice little layer lock here. When I set that, the pixels are preserved, and now I can push a little lighter or darker gradation across the surface, and it's not going to affect anything else other than the pixels that are painted on the layer. So that's a way that I kind of produce lace in a nutshell. Now, like I said in the beginning, there's several ways of doing this, and I just showed you pretty much just this one, but I find that this one is user-friendly for beginners. And if you're a beginner to all of this, then stick with this for just a little bit and then brave going in and doing a direct painting. It won't be too difficult once you've experienced this a few times. And when you work on this assignment this week, make sure you pick something that is simple. Do not go after anything crazy. Like this image right here is fairly simple. It's just a small space that has the lace in it. If you happen to pick an entire dress, that's going to drive you a little bit crazy as your very first assignment, unless you happen to be that type of person that like that challenge. And I'm perfectly fine with that too. But pick something that's a little bit mild or simpler so that you can get through this one in addition to the other ones that you need to get through too. All right, I hope you found that beneficial for making lace. Good luck with this, and again, if there's ever any issues with something complicated like this, don't paint it all straight in. Do it in layers, break it down into components, and it'll make your life a lot easier.